Today we are going to have the last point to discuss in reader response criticism or theories. And in this reader oriented theories, we have seen different theorists discussing about reader's response, where we have talked about Husserl, Heidegger, Gadamer, then Hans Robert Joas, Wolfgang Iser. We talked about all those things, and now we are moving towards the last bunch of theorists, where we'll find out how other diverse inflections of reader-oriented theory are represented by the three critics which we are going to talk about. Stanley Fish, Michel Rafferty, and David Bleach. We are going to talk about these three critics. To begin with, Stanley Fish. Stanley Fish, the American critic who focused basically on 17th century English literature. And he developed a perspective called an affective stylistics. Like Wolfgang Iser, he concentrates on the adjustments of expectation to be made by readers as they pass along the text. But considers this at the immediately local level of the sentence. He separates his approach very self-consciously from all kinds of formalism by denying literary language has any special status, because that is what is commonly considered as that every literary language is having a different status. And he used to point out that we use the same reading strategies to interpret literary and non-literary sentences. There is no different strategies followed by the reader. His attention is directed to the developing responses of the reader in relation to the words of sentences as they succeed one after another in a time. He, for making it clear, chooses Milton's very famous line from Paradise Lost. Milton, in his Paradise Lost, described the fallen angels' state of awareness, how they have plummeted from heaven to hell. Milton wrote in his Paradise Lost a line, nor did they perceive the evil plight. This is the line he wrote, a very famous line. Now, this cannot be treated as a statement equivalent to a statement which I will say once again, they perceived the evil plight. Now, we must attend, this is what Stanley Fish argues, that we must attain and we must point out that to a sequence of words which creates a state of suspension in the reader's mind, who hangs between two views of fallen angels. Now, his point, what he's making, because we used to follow word sequence as explained by the reader, as appeared in the poem written by Milton. Now, what Stanley Fish is making a point is weak in its sense, though you cannot refute it, but it is a weak statement, weak sentence. By the fact that why it is weak, because Milton was imitating the double negative style of classical epic. In classical epic, everything is being uttered in a double negative. Double negative style is being used by Milton very deliberately in Paradise Lost. But another theorist, another critic, Walter Pater, receives an especially sensitive analysis given by Fish. What is Walter Pater is saying that this is at least a flame like our life has, that it is but the concurrence renewed from moment to moment of forces parting sooner or later on their waves. This is the statement, this is the analysis given by Walter Pater. Now, what he is pointing out here, Pater points out that by interrupting concurrence of forces with renewed moment, renewed from moment to moment, of forces parting sooner or later, Pater prevents the reader from establishing a definite or stable image in mind. We cannot establish a typical image in the mind. And at each stage, When the reader is reading at each state, in each stage, in the sentence, force the sentence always force the reader to make an adjustment in expectation and interpretation. The sentence forced the reader. The idea of concurrence is disrupted by departing, by taking away. And this parting is temporarily certain. The reader's expectation of meaning is continuously adjusted. The meaning is the total movement of reading because you're adjusting the meaning continuously. Jonathan Kuehler, which we have discussed earlier about Jonathan Kuehler. Jonathan Kuehler has supported Stanley Fish's aim, but he has criticized Stanley Fish for failing to give us a proper theoretical formulation of his reader's criticism. Because what Fish believes that his readings of sentences simply follow the natural practice of informed reader. Because in his view, a reader is someone who possesses a literary competence. A reader possesses a literary competence in itself. The reader has internalized the syntactic and semantic knowledge which is required for reading. Because when you read, you have a syntactic knowledge, semantic knowledge of that particular language. Then and then it is possible for you to enjoy the reading. Then and then it is possible for you to understand the reading. Now, the informed reader of literary text has also acquired specifically you can call it a literary competence. He acquired a literary competence there. He has some knowledge of literary conventions when you read a literary text. Now, based on this understanding, Jonathan Kuehler makes two trenchant criticisms of Fish position, what sort of position Fish has taken in reader response. What Jonathan Kuehler wrote, Fish, he talks about Stanley Fish. He fails to theorize the conventions of reading. That is the first, you can say, is pointing out the error that Stanley Fish is having in his understanding of readers' response. He fails to theorize the conventions of reading. That is, he fails to ask the question. Stanley Fish never asked this question that what conventions do reader follow when they read? What sort of convention a reader is following when he reads certain text? And the second trenchant criticism he made on Fish is what Fish says or claims. He mentioned as the second important criticism on Stanley Fish says that his claim to read sentences word by word in a temporal sequence is misleading. When you start reading, what he says that we read word by word. It has got typical temporal sequence. You cannot remove the temporal sequence of reading any text. But Kuhler say it is misleading. Because what Kuhler used to say that there is no reason to believe that the readers actually do take in sentences such a piecemeal and in a particular gradual way. No reader will take that. Why does he assume, for example, that the reader who is facing Milton or Milton's sentence, nor did they not perceive, the reader will experience a sense of being suspended between the two views. The two views, nor did they not perceive. That is what Kuhler is saying, that the reader will experience he is being caught up, he is being suspended in the two views. There is, friends, something suspicious or fact, or you can say there is something factitious about Fish's continual willingness to be surprised by the next word in a sequence. It's a fact that the reader is always surprised by the next word which is coming into the sequence, into that line, into that sentence. Fish himself admits that his approach tends to privilege those texts which proceeds in self-determining way. He's talking about those texts which are giving their own ideas to the readers. Self-Consuming Artifacts, title of a book written in 1972 by himself. He wrote a book called Self-Consuming Artifacts, in which he mentioned this particular point that his approach tends to privilege those texts which proceed in self-undermining way. They'll find out their own way, they have their own pathway developed, made the readers to understand what exactly is written there, what exactly is mentioned there. Elizabeth frowned. She points out that in order to sustain his reader or his reader's orientation, Fish has to suppress the fact that actual experience of reading is not the same thing as a verbal rendering of that experience. Fish has suppressed this understanding, suppressed this idea. That when you try to read actual experience of reading is not the same when you try to find out the experience from the words. The experience getting from the words are different. By treating his own reading experience as itself an act of interpretation, he is ignoring the gap between the experience and the understanding of experience. What Fish gives us is not a definitive account of the nature of reading. He's not giving a definitive account of reading, what Husler or what Wolfgang Iser had done. But Fish's understanding of his own reading experience, he's giving his own reading experience and considering it as interpretation of the reader. In one of his another book written in 1980, is there a text in this class? This is the title of his book written in 1980. Fish acknowledges that his earlier work treated his own experience of reading as the norm. And he goes on to justify this position by introducing the idea of interpretative communities. Because there is what he was trying to persuade, what he was trying to deal, that he was trying to persuade readers to adopt a set of community assumption, because every community is what Fish is saying, that every community is having an assumption, and it is the reader living in that community needs to adopt that set of community assumption so that they can when they read, they would do what I did, because he said that I am following a set of community assumptions. Every reader has to follow a set of community assumption if he is trying to if he is trying to reach to one particular status. Now, friends, there are, of course, there may be different groups of readers who adopt a particular kinds of reading strategy. But in this latter phase of his work, the strategies of a particular interpretative communities, we no longer need to choose between asking question about the text or about the reader, because the whole problem of subject and object disappears in Stanley Fish's argument. However, the price that must be paid for this solution is very high. By reducing the whole process of meaning production to already existing conventions of society, or conventions of interpretative community, Fish seems to abandon all possibility of a deviant interpretations or resistance. He's avoiding all this. There may be a possibility of having different kinds of interpretations. There may be a chance of having different kind of analysis, which usually governs the act of interpretation. As Elizabeth Fround points out, that the appeal of imperialism of agreement can chill the spines of readers who experience of community is less happy, benign than Fish assumes. That we have to rely on what community assumes rather than you can understand on your own. This is what Fish's very important different kind of perception about readers' role in reading. Another important critique of reader response is the French semiotician Michael Raftery. Michael Raftery very interestingly agrees with the idea of Russian formalism, because Russian formalism pertinently pointed out that poetry as a special use of language. Poetry uses a special kind of language. Ordinary language is practical and is used to refer some sort of reality, while poetic language focuses on the message at the end of every discussion, every poem. Raftery takes this formalistic view from Roman Jakobson, the linguist which we discussed in earlier debates. But in a well-known essay, Raftery attacks Jakobson and Lévi-Strauss's interpretation of the very famous Baudelaire's poem that we talked about, Les Chats, in yesterday's discussion. Raftery shows that the linguistic features they discover in the poem could not be possibly perceived by even any informed reader. You cannot able to perceive it. If any informed reader knows about that, he cannot perceive that particular thing. All the manners of grammatical and phonetic patterns are thrown up by their structuralist approach. But they not but not all the feature they note can be part of poetic structure for the reader. If you see that a poetic structure, when it is having its own unique feature, you have to understand the unique features of that particular writings. Although the structuralist approach never follow a typical phonemic pattern, all the patterns are not known to the informed readers also. For proving his argument, he gives example. And in giving the example, he objects to their claim that by conducting a line with a word in his poem, because this is what the analysis done by the earlier critics. And to counter this, Michel Refractory has taken this stance. In a concluding line, there is a word called, we have not read the actual French poem, but there are certain words used. That's why we have to believe what these critics are arguing with each other. He said that there is a word used in the end of the line of the poem called volupte, Volupte. This is a French word. Baudelaire, what Refractory is saying, is making a play with the fact that a feminine noun, this is actually a feminine noun. This is what you have to understand the grammar of that particular language. If you understand the grammar of that particular language, then and then it is possible for you to understand that text very comfortably. Now, Baudelaire has used a feminine noun instead, is used as he used a feminine noun as a masculine rhyme. And in this way, Refractory says that he has created a sexual ambiguity in the poem. Now, Refractory, if you understand, if you consider this example, Refractory is rightly pointing out that a reasonably practiced reader may never have heard of these technical terms. A reader may not have to understand the technical terms, masculine and feminine rhyme. And that's why Refractory is pointing out that there is some difficulty in explaining why something pursued by Jacobson does not count as evidence of what readers perceive in a text. You cannot say that what Roman Jacobson is saying, you cannot perceive that same thing in the text because it is not known to the reader himself. Refractory developed his theory in his famous book written in 1978 titled Semiotics of Poetry. In that book, he argues that the competent readers go beyond surface meaning. If we agree, my friend, if we regard a poem as a string of statements, we are limiting ourselves to its meaning, which is merely what it can be said to represent in units of information. If we attend only to a poem's meaning, we reduce it to a string of unrelated bits, and possibly it will be treated as nonsensical. A true response, starts by noticing that the elements or the signs in a poem often appear to depart from the normal grammar or normal representation. They are not following the normal grammar. They are not following the normal presentation in a poem. The poem seems to be establishing significance only indirectly, not directly, please understand it. And in doing so, it threatens the literary representation of reality. It is not following the literary representations of reality. It requires only ordinary linguistic competence to understand the poem's meaning. But reader who is reading it requires literary competence. If you want to get the meaning, you can get meaning very easily. But a reader who is deliberately reading it requires literary competence. Why he requires literary competence? Because he has to deal with the frequent ungrammaticalities. It is not following the proper grammar as you know it. Poems are not following a regular pattern of grammar that we study. We try to learn grammar to understand the semantic and syntactic constructions of that particular language. But a poem is not following these grammaticalities. So for understanding the ungrammaticalities that poem is carrying, we need to have a literary competence. A reader needs to have a literary competence. Because we have to face with certain stumbling blocks of ungrammaticalities, and then the reader is forced to enter into it. The reader is entering into it very deliberately. During the process of reading, to uncover the second higher level of significance, which will explain the ungrammatical features of the text. What will ultimately is uncovered, it is ultimately uncovering the structural matrix which can be reduced to a single sentence or a single word. Single sentence or a single word in a poem can be a complete structural matrix. This matrix, my friend, can be deduced only indirectly and is not actually present as a word or a structure in a poem. The poem is connected to its matrix by certain familiar statements, by cliches, by quotations, by conventional associations. Every poem is connected to its matrix by actual version of matrix. Versions of matrix are in the form of familiar statements, cliches, quotations, or conventional associations, which are called as hypograms. These things are called as hypograms. It is the matrix which ultimately gives a poem unity. Now, this reading process, if you try to understand what he is trying to develop refactory, if you want to summarize it, we can summarize it in this in the following forms. We can summarize it. Try to read for ordinary meaning. Second point, you can say highlight those elements which appear ungrammatical and which obstruct an ordinary mimetic interpretation. Third point, discover the hypograms or commonplaces which receive expanded or unfamiliar expressions in the text. Fourth statement, you can say, fourth point, you can say that derive the matrix from the hypograms. That is, find a single statement or a word capable of generating hypograms and the text. Find out those things. If we try hesitantly, my friend, and we try to apply this theory to the Wordsworth's poem that we have seen, A Slumber Did My Spirit Seal. If you try to follow these 4 points which I have talked to you right now, if you apply it, you might finally arrive at a matrix that it is talking about spirit and matter. And the hypograms, or you can say commonplaces, which are reworked in the text, appear to be death is the end of life, or you can say the human spirit cannot die, or you can say in death we return to the earth from which we came. These are common hypograms, common places that you will find out in understanding about death by everyone in the society also, apart from any literary reader. Now the poem achieves unity by reworking these common places in an unexpected way from the basic matrix. If you come from an unexpected way of basic matrix, you will be able to find out the meaning. That's why you can say, no doubt, refractory's theory would look stronger if we had given one of his own examples of from Baudelaire or Gauter, the French poets, because his approach seems much more appropriate as a way of reading difficult poetry, which goes against the grain of normal grammar or semantics. As a general theory of reading, it has many difficulties. Not least that it disallows several kinds of reading that you might or I might think preferably straightforward. This is how refractory has posed his own understanding of reader's response. Quickly, we will see how the third critique, which I am talking about in reader response, is David Bleach, who is actually an American critique who has derived his approach from psychology. His very famous book written in 1978 titled Subjective Criticism. It is a sophisticated argument in favor of a shift from objective to subjective paradigm. He argues, David Bleach argues, that modern philosophers of science have denied the existence of an objective world of the facts. They have denied the objective world of the facts. Even in science, perceiver's mental structure will decide what count it as an objective facts. Knowledge is made by people and not found, because the object of observation appears changed by the act of observation. He goes on to insist that the advances of knowledge are determined by the needs of the community. When we say that science has replaced superstition, we are not describing a passage from darkness to light or anything else, but we are changing in a paradigm which occurs when certain urgent need of the new community come into conflict with old beliefs and demand some new beliefs. At that time, you try to change the paradigm. The old beliefs are not required. The new beliefs are required. There is a conflict between these two. At that time, there is a shift in paradigm. Subjective criticism is based on the assumption that each person's most urgent motivation are to understand himself. We are trying to understand ourselves, our most urgent motivations. In his classroom experiments, David Bleach was led to distinguish between the two things. The first thing is that reader's spontaneous response to a text, and second, the meaning the reader attributed to it. Now, the latter, the second point, is usually presented as an objective interpretation. But this objective interpretation is necessarily developed from subjective response of the reader. If the reader is not responding, how can you develop an objective interpretation? Whatever systems of thought are being employed, whether it is moralist, Marxist, structuralist, psychoanalytic, extractivist, etc. Interpretation of particular text will normally reflect the subjective individuality of a person's response. It will show subjective individuality. It depends on person to person. It varies from person to person. My meaning is need not to be have the same meaning that you are also carrying with you. It changes without grounding in response. The application of systems of thought will be dismissed as empty formula derived from any sort of received dogma. Particular interpretations make more sense when critics take the trouble to explain the growth and origin of their views. Your understanding of a text makes more sense than you are following any critic to make you to explain that particular thing. And that's why time and again we used to point out, time and again we used to say that we have to understand our own reading capabilities and our own reading conditions. Friends, reader oriented theories, if you see very carefully that we have discussed so far, those theories have no single or predominant philosophical starting point. You cannot say that there is one particular reading oriented or reading response criticism. If you see the thinkers we have considered or the writers which we have considered, they belong to a quite different traditions of thought. They are not following the same tradition. And there are very few common terms or positions among them. There is no common position. See the German writers Joas and Iser, they draw upon phenomenology and hermeneutics in their attempts to describe the process of reading in terms of reader's consciousness. You can find out refractories presupposes a reader who possesses a specifically literary competence in himself, while you will find out Fish believes that the reader responds to the sequence of words in a sentence, whether or not that sentence is literary or not literary. Or Bleach regards reading as a process which depends upon the subjective psychology of the reader. And even we have discussed in post-structuralism and deconstruction about Roland Barthes, who celebrates the end of structuralism's regime by granting the reader a power to create their own meaning by opening the text to find out certain codes that are hidden inside. Roland Barthes is giving that freedom to the reader. Whatever else one may take from these reader theories, reader's response theories, is that there is no doubt that they fundamentally challenge the predominance of text oriented theories that are associated with new criticism and formalism. But we can no longer talk about the meaning of a text without taking into account the reader's contribution to it. We have to accept, we have to understand the reader's contribution in finding out the meaning of context. This is how the reader response criticism, this is how the reader oriented theory have developed this idea. You can apply, you can use this reader response theory even for your dissertation that you are going to use. This is one of the tools that you can follow in your methodology of pursuing your research in literature and literary activities. In this way, we come to an end with reader response criticism.